Hey everybody, welcome back to Turn Bark Time. I'm the Turn.
I'm the Bark.
We are still here a long time because guess what? It is still season 4, episode 10. 10. We are continuing with our theme that we started last week when we asked ourselves where would Wakanda be if it were a real country or a real place in Africa. Building off of that, that has a lot to do with African American or Black History Month, which is the month of February. And so pushing forward, Barker had a idea based on a book that one of his students was reading. And so I'm going to turn it over to him and let him tell you the story.
Yeah, so this is out of like 2 different interactions with kids at school. I don't think either of them are listeners or followers, but one student asked me about like if we are going to have any Black History Month lessons in AP World, and I'm like, I really don't have the freedom to like put stuff in there because we're on a time schedule that's dictated by the overlords of AP. And then again, I have an avid kid in my regular world class, a sophomore, that's reading a novel set in Tulsa in the 1920s. And she was asking me, she goes, why do so many people like not know about this? And so it kind of led to a conversation, which it was at lunch. And it just kind of led to like one of those like teachable moments where like they asked like, well, why don't people know about this? And so we kind of talked about uncomfortable history, which there's a lot of, and in the standard American textbook, they don't like to talk about the uncomfortable history. And so today we're going to talk about the Tulsa Massacre, Tulsa race riot, and I'll get into like those 2 different monikers for it.
Yeah,
kind of comes around, and like for me, I don't remember ever learning about this in school.
No.
And I will say that in 2019, HBO made a series based on the comic or the graphic novel The Watchmen, and built off of that. And the opening scene of Watchmen, the series, starts with the Tulsa Massacre occurring, and a bunch of people were like, well, you can't just go back and like make up history and just like say that this happened in America. And then like HBO's like, well, no, it did happen. Like, we didn't make this up, and like this is all based on like fact. Like, obviously the superhero stuff that they did later, like they're like, that's made up. But like this event is a real event that occurred in Tulsa. And so for those of you who are just like at ground zero, I guess, in 1921, the end of May, there was just a massive, like, small, like, I guess, relatively brief time period of, like, what accounts to pretty much lawlessness, where a very successful Black community in Tulsa was pretty much destroyed.
Yeah.
Like, over, like, a 12-hour period, went from being what people called the Black Wall Street.
Yep.
To being burnt rubble in a matter of hours. Like
much of it sanctioned.
Yeah.
By government, like allowing it to happen.
Yeah, and so like this neighborhood, I got kind of taking a pump in the brakes for a minute. Like everybody generally starts with the idea of like there was this Black Wall Street in the Greenwood area, Greenwood district of Tulsa, which was North Tulsa. There was a set of train tracks, and essentially north of the tracks was the land that African Americans or Black people were allowed to like settle in. And it grew into this like 34 to 36 blocks of just African American. It was like this little, I mean, there's even sources that call it like Little Africa, but like just because of Jim Crow laws, a very concentrated district of Blacks in Tulsa, but very affluent, culturally, economically, like one of the most like booming communities like in the United States at the time existed there. But then like everybody talks about the destruction that happens, but nobody talks about like if I told you that the most successful black community in America in 1920 was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, you probably wouldn't believe me.
No.
And so like as I researched this episode, like I started like everybody else, and I started with like the terrible occurrences of the 31st of May 31st and June 1st.
Mm-hmm.
And then like I found myself going, but like why Tulsa?
Yeah.
Like why is this happening here? And so for those of you who don't know, like Oklahoma's one of the last continental or contiguous states to enter the Union because of its high Native American population. And at the end of the Civil War, they passed treaties with the Big Five, the Choctaws, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, the Muskogee, and the Seminoles, saying that like they would stop having slavery. And then they essentially said it's the equivalent of like the special order that like Sherman signed in South Carolina and Georgia, giving freedmen 40 acres and a mule.
Yep.
Except for the Native Americans they actually held the Native Americans to it, where in the South during Reconstruction, they really didn't hold white Southerners to that. And so like in my mind, I guess the really sad thing is that Greenwood is this success story, like the successful anomaly that really could have been what Reconstruction should have been. And even that, like it's not a perfect analogy because like, you know, African Americans could own land in Oklahoma. And that's really the difference, is that instead of like the Deep South, where like they went from being slaves to being freedmen, and then they sharecropped, where they rented land and all of that wealth goes directly back to the main landowner.
Mm-hmm.
These Black Americans moved to Oklahoma, could own the land, and as they began to push for economic improvement, they were the ones receiving the capital. And there's two, O.W. Gurley and J.B. Stratford were kind of like the two guys that started Greenwood in 1906, and then it becomes a state in 1907. Oklahoma gets statehood in 1907, so it started, in a way, it was to their benefit that it was Indian country.
Yeah.
And so like they bought these like stretches of land, and then like I guess the terrible farmland in Oklahoma was terrible farmland, but it was great oil land.
Mm-hmm.
And so like these oil wells start popping up that are owned by African Americans or Black people. And so the wealth comes into those those families. And like really what happens is Greenwood grows because people are leaving the Deep South to go to Oklahoma because they can own land. So it's that idea of like almost like manifest destiny, but like for Blacks. And so like they start with he builds a grocery store, like Gurley builds a grocery store and a couple of like boarding houses, and it's named Greenwood because that was the name of the town in Mississippi where people like left to come live in these boarding houses. Mm-hmm. And like the road didn't have a name, so he named it after where they came from in Mississippi.
Yeah.
And so and then it grows from there to the point that Booker T. Washington visits, and he calls it the Negro Wall Street, which obviously like Negro is an antiquated term, which it's more today, like people still use the term the Black Wall Street. Mm-hmm. And really it was the idea that even the African Americans that worked in like the service jobs, because there was still segregation, still Jim Crow, but like they could do kind of like the domestic servant jobs. Mm-hmm. And like those were higher paying than just like, I guess, grunt labor jobs.
Yeah.
They would go earn that money from white employers, but would bring their dollars back to Greenwood and spend their dollars with black business owners. So like it in Jim Crow in a way is what created the success, because it prevented the black community from like integrating with the white community. And so like it grows into this just like this bustling place that has its own school system. It has a hospital with a completely black staff. Like kids are graduating from one of the two schools, and they're attending Columbia, HBCs like Tuskegee, Hamilton, Spelman. Like that's part of what's going on at the time period, is that like it's grown into this because people like from 1906 until 1920, like that community just keeps putting more money back into it. So the community keeps growing, and they keep just providing more services to themselves because they have to. Like Jim Crow segregation says, like, well, like Tulsa incorporates, like takes on Greenwood as part of Tulsa, but doesn't extend community services like they should. And so again, that puts more impetus on the people in that area to do it for themselves. And I thought that was really interesting. And so like talking about how like I got that quote about like they were Jim Crow like helped them create, like Jim Crow like led to this economy growing even faster, was from a local a Tulsa historian named Hannibal B. Johnson. And then I found another stat that said of the 32 black townships that were founded after the Civil War, 28 of them are in Oklahoma.
But that makes sense based off what you said, like with the working with Native Americans versus working with people that are white. One of the things that I love that you're digging in deep and stuff like that, because it's, so I guess one thing that we want to preface just based on who's listening, right? We don't know historical knowledge and everything like that. When Barker mentions Jim Crow laws are laws designed to disadvantage African Americans or people of color versus white people. So it could be something as simple as you're not allowed to live here if you're not that race. It could be, this restaurant allows white people to sit in it, but African Americans have to take their food to go, right? Back of the bus, front of the bus, giving up seats, those types of things. That's the Jim Crow law that he is referencing, just in case that's something you didn't necessarily know off the top of your head. So
yeah, and like J.B. Stratford, who's like one of the two like pillars of starting the community, at one point takes a train ride, buys a first class ticket, and then causes a ruckus because they're like, well, no, you have to go back to the colored car. And he's like, well, no, I bought a first class ticket.
Yeah,
like I can afford, like, you know what I mean? Like they had their own airport because like people were coming in to like scout oil fields and whatnot. And it was just like, it was out of necessity. And it's like, fine, if you don't want our money, we're going to spend our money here.
Yeah.
And it really led to like, that's what leads to this like black kind of like, not utopia, but like oasis of like culture. And it just seems so like, at first it seems so random, like why the middle of Oklahoma? And then like when you start digging into those other like pieces, it's like, oh, well, this makes sense more now because it wasn't a state, it was Indian territory, you know what I mean? And so like where they didn't hold white landowners accountable in the South because we were trying to bridge the post-Civil War gaps. So we didn't really defeat the South. They didn't have those qualms when they were dealing with the Native American tribes of the Indian Territory, who they've already uprooted and pushed there in the first place. So again, that's kind of, I think too many people don't talk about how Greenwood became the Black Wall Street. And I think it was really interesting to me finding that piece of history. So like it makes this story a little bit, well, I guess in a way, like it gives more context rather than just like, here's a really terrible thing that happened. Like this was a great place.
Right.
And this is why it happened in that spot. And again, at this point, we're talking about a community of about 10,000 African Americans in Tulsa. And so what happens is on May 30th, Pardon me as I flip to my 2 pages of notes for this bad boy.
Yeah, sure.
A 19-year-old shoe shiner, black shoe shiner named Dick Rowland, had to use the bathroom. He worked at he was a black employee at a predominantly white shoe shine parlor in downtown Tulsa. And he had to go to another building, the Drexel building, to the 4th floor because that's the only
colored bathroom
that's available. And so he rides the elevator, and the elevator is being operated by a white teenage female named Sarah Page. And nobody really knows what happens in the elevator for sure. Mm-hmm. But like most accounts say that he the elevator jolted and he bumped into her or stepped on her foot. She screams and he freaks out and bolts.
Yeah.
And so the cops, a clerk comes over, a white clerk comes over, consoles her. They call the cops, and by the next day, Dick Rowland's in jail.
Yep.
And that doesn't seem super problematic, but as I watched, thanks to Watchmen, and because it was the centennial of this happening in 2021, a lot of 60 Minutes and CNN and a bunch of different news agencies went out and actually found, actually did their research and was oh yeah, we should talk about this. And then I watched testimony of the last 3 survivors of this riot or this massacre, and they're all the youngest of the 3 was 100.
Yeah.
And the other 2 were 106. Mm-hmm. Testifying before Congress, a subcommittee of Congress. But really what kicks this up and makes this into a problem is that the Tulsa Tribune, which is a white paper in Tulsa, prints an article saying that Rowland was arrested for attempted rape, assault.
Yeah.
Which essentially they said at that time period, when you say that a person of color assaults a white woman, the assumption is that it's sexual assault.
Yeah.
And there's an inflammatory article or editorial that runs next to it that magically has disappeared from record, recommending, essentially insinuating that there should be a lynching that night.
Yeah.
And less than a year before, in August of 1920, a white mob had gone to the jail, pulled an accused murderer out, and lynched a murderer. So Tulsa has a history of vigilante justice within the last year. And so by 7:30 on the 31st, you have hundreds of white Tulsans that are demanding that the jail release Rowland into their custody. Essentially, these people who are not law enforcement agents, not law officers, just random angry citizens that read this newspaper article and are essentially foaming at the mouth, right? By 9 o'clock, news gets to Greenwood of what's going on. They estimate about 25 Black World War I veterans, essentially many of them in uniform, arm themselves and go down to the jail, the county jail, and offer their services to the sheriff to help protect the accused from being removed from the jail. And the sheriff essentially tells them, no, it's fine, go home. We got this under control. We're not going to give him to them. Just go home. And then things kind of get murky at that point. There's some accounts that say that the mob goes to the National Guard armory and tries to arm themselves, but the National Guard is is able to tell them go away. This isn't happening. We're not doing that. That kind of filters in. Imagine this is a time period where there's a lot of speculation, and newspapers aren't exactly, this is a time period of yellow journalism, right? So newspapers aren't exactly being held accountable for quote unquote improving the truth, to sell more papers, to improve circulation. And so by 10 o'clock, 75 African American or black citizens, black Tulsans, return to downtown with, again, are armed and offer to help the sheriff maintain order. And then at this point, one of the white citizens tries to disarm one of the black citizens. A shot goes off. It's kind of like the Battle of Lexington.
Yep.
Nobody knows who shot first. But at that point, like, this is where the violence escalates and stuff goes off the rails. And so starting kind of at like 11 o'clock midnight, or like 10 o'clock through the night until the morning, people start shooting at each other.
Yep.
A black man is murdered in a downtown theater just simply because he was a black man in the white part of town at that point. And this is where like things kind of like, it seems almost unbelievable when you start reading the accounts and hearing these firsthand primary sources. But the local authorities at first are not very reactive.
No, they think it's just going to blow over.
Yeah, and they're like, well, we'll let it calm down. It'll be okay. And then eventually the sheriff starts deputizing people, many of whom were actually the people who were
causing the problem.
In the mob to begin with. And so like there's this fear, I guess for more context, in the summer of 1919, after World War I, there's been a kind of resurgence of white supremacist activity across the United States, of lynchings, of people trying to prevent Black Americans from gaining more power and exercising the rights that Reconstruction was supposed to give them. And like a lot of, like, again, these guys were World War I vets in uniform who were trying to sit there and say, hey, we're doing the right thing. And people are trying to disarm them. Like, you wouldn't go up to a soldier and try and take a gun from a soldier. And things aren't much better today. Like, we had a group of people with firearms walk into the Michigan State Capitol building and nobody stopped them.
Yeah.
You have these protests where white Americans have ARs across their chest and everybody's super fine with that. But as soon as people of color start wearing ARs across their chest, people start freaking out. You know what I mean? So there's still that power dynamic is still very...
Yep, absolutely.
Very inequitable today in America's zeitgeist. But the long and short of it is that they chase the black Tulsans to the train tracks. They start fighting, and then it pushes over into the community, into Greenwood. And at one point, like, there's people get a machine gun and they put it in like a grain elevator and they're firing down on Greenwood Avenue. There's reports of airplanes dropping turpentine balls on top of buildings to like burn down buildings on purpose. There's some accounts of them potentially dropping like explosives, but that one's a little less proven historically than the firebombing, essentially. But like, think about that, like people flying airplanes over an American city, burning down a city in America. Like, you know, this isn't supposed to happen in America.
No. Well, and you look, and it's like when stuff like this happens, like we can jump really quick back to the beginning where you're like, we don't talk about this. Like, I never heard of this, right? Until you came into my room one day and was like, "Did you watch Watchmen?" And I was like, "No, I don't watch that show." And you're like, "Oh my God, like, gotta go look this up." And like, this isn't something that like we have a system of justice in our country. Like, we have a design system. So if this is really an assault, like I clicked on like the newspaper article that it reads is very like, she describes him like scratching her hands and her face and tearing the clothes. And then when he's arrested, he says, "No, I accidentally touched her. Like, I did touch her on accident. And now we're firebombing our own citizens."
Yeah, and he eventually gets exonerated.
Yeah, and his crime is nothing.
Yeah, there is no crime. She refuses to sign any statement like actually says that he assaulted her. So it really does come down to like, it was blown out of proportion. And like, think about it. Like, it's a time period where you have a minority group that's being very successful, more successful than potentially, right,
The
poor
majority.
people of the majority.
Yeah.
And that's what breeds that anger. I mean, it's not that difference than like, why was there anti-Semitism across Europe? And it's like, well,
Yeah.
the Jewish like enclaves were very economically successful. And when you're the minority and you're more successful than the majority,
People get mad about it.
a lot of times historically, like the majority will become frustrated, and not that it's justified, but like if it's not kept under control, or people, like actively are working to try and prevent
Yeah.
some sort of discrimination. But when the discrimination is law,
Mhm.
you know what I mean? Like, it just sets this up. And so like by 9:15, the National Guard arrives, because the National Guard had been protecting a white neighborhood from a counterattack that they'd heard rumor of. So again, they're not actively stopping the white citizens from killing the black citizens. They're protecting the white citizens from the fear of the black citizens who are actually being like
killed.
chased from their home,
Yeah.
shot in the street, firebombed. A prominent surgeon, AC Jackson, surrenders to the mob. Like, they, what I mean, like, goes out, like they say, like, put your hands up, and he does all that, and then they shoot him anyways, and he bleeds out in the street.
Yeah.
Right. They estimate 1,256 homes were burned.
Mm-hmm.
Businesses were essentially looted, then burned. Right.
They arrested every single member that they could. They arrested or detained people, some as long as like 8 days after this is over. And then they literally, with nobody left to defend it, they just burned it to the ground. And literally just destroyed, left nothing in its wake.
Yeah. The National Guard showed up and escorted black Tulsans to concentration camps.
Yep.
And then at that point, they were held in the camps until a white citizen would come and vouch that that black citizen was a good person. And then they were given a green card that had the name of their sponsor on it, as well as all of like their like normal identification details.
Yep.
And it's called a riot. And the problem with it being called a riot is that it implies like lawlessness on both sides.
Yep.
Where the Greenwood community is like, no, we weren't rioting. We were trying to protect ourselves.
Defending ourselves.
We were attacked. Like, that's why they prefer that. Like, that's why it's been shifted to like more people say massacre. But at that time in 1921, by calling it a riot in the news, insurance companies have have a riot clause. Yeah. So if your property is damaged during a riot, they don't have to pay out. Mm-hmm. And so they said, out of, I think it was 1,400 claims that come in for over like $4 million worth of damage. Yep. And that's in that time period, not inflated, which means that's a huge amount. 90% of the claims are denied because it happened during a riot. So like, you don't get any money, which means some of these, so like both Gurley and what's it, Stratford, they both relocate. Gurley moves to LA, and then Stratford moves to Chicago. But the people do come back and rebuild Greenwood.
Yeah. By 1942, it's booming again. It's rebuilt, but it never gets to what it once was.
And it's rebuilt off of their own savings and their own capital. It's not like it should be rebuilt using insurance dollars, because these people are victims of crimes, like they're victims of arson. So It's like me coming and burning down your house, and then you have to pay to build a new house.
Yep.
And many of these black Tulsans like come back. I think they said something like, what was it? 80 of the businesses within a year are rebuilt. It was something like just under 800 of the homes. So like about 75% of the homes are rebuilt. But as soon as it happened, the Tulsa City Committee, like city, like council comes in and they rezone parts of the district to industrial because they essentially, so you got rid of it's not that dissimilar than what happened to Native Americans, right? Like you displace them and then you rezone it so you can't come back and rebuild your home because that's no longer residential, that's industrial area.
Mhm.
They sell that to white companies. Some people do come back. It is growing. And then in the 1960s, the interstate system comes through. And using eminent domain, Tulsa again says, well, just bring the 244 right here. And it goes right over where the Dreamland Theater, which was like built by the Williams family
Yep.
and was like a crown jewel of the community. Like there's a freeway there now.
Yep.
And then US 75 runs north through it. So they literally, with using eminent domain, the stewards of Tulsa did things before the civil rights movement really kind of takes root, right? And you can't change hearts and minds with a policy.
Yeah.
They essentially use eminent domain to destroy Greenwood again. And that's really what the complaint is today, is that they're like, look, like you put the freeway right through, and like this is not an Greenwood. Black communities are communities that are sub-communities of cities that are often of people of color or of lower economic status that were established during times of segregation, still have those settlement patterns. And then when there is urban renewal, which I think was the term that Tulsa used, and governments use eminent domain, it is generally those districts or those enclave communities where those, oh, I'm sorry, we got to knock your house down so we can build a new freeway.
Yeah.
Because those are the people who don't have the means to fight back.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, it's kind of sad. Like it's almost like this, you understand why the people who are like, well, no, this is part of our history. Like there's people that grew up in Greenwood that didn't know about Greenwood.
Yeah.
Like there's a guy who talks about, like, I was at Oklahoma University.
Yeah. Yep.
And, you know, my professor is talking in African-American studies, and he's talking about this great, you know, community that was in North Tulsa. And he's like, I'm from North Tulsa. I don't know this place.
Yeah.
He goes, I'm from that place. So like, I think that's the big push, is that there needs to be education that this did happen. And it is uncomfortable because, like, oftentimes decisions aren't made in a vacuum.
Yeah.
Right? And people have agendas. And unfortunately for this area, right, the Black community of North Tulsa end up paying the price, like, over and over and over again. And it's kind of to the point where people, rather than fighting it, like, are moving to communities where there's more opportunity rather than trying to fight against the system.
Yeah.
Because it's kind of like fighting against, like, you know, loaded dice at a casino.
Right. And one of the craziest things about this is, like, that strikes me is well, I guess, so, like, going through and, like, doing the research, like, all the primary sources, right, from that weekend, right, or days, are written, you know, from a context. Like, there was a newspaper headline that was like 70 Negroes and 10 white people died in rioting, and then it was like and it said town quiet now under soldiers rule or something like that. And then, like, the next one was like, it was like, grand jury sees the African Americans incited the riot, all whites exonerated. And it's like, just the fact that it's like you're not listing names of people, you're listing, like, their race, you know, just kind of shows it. And this is going to be uncomfortable to talk about, and people don't want to talk about it, and that's okay, right? Like, you're not supposed to feel comfortable, right? You're supposed to remember that this sucks, like, this happened, right? And are we judging you based on the fact that you're white? No, right? This was decisions, and this is the reality of the situation. We can't hide from this. Right, you look at, like, I think the biggest example that you can look at is you take the Germans, right? Like, they don't deny what happened, in their history. They don't deny what happened in the Holocaust. They don't deny what Nazism was. And they try and learn from it and keep an eye out it, until to make sure that it never happens again. And I think one of the things is just personal opinion. I think that we as a country, we don't want to say that. We don't want to be wrong that we did something wrong. So
I think, yeah, like my 2 cents for it, for the people who are like, well, you're teaching kids to hate America. I'm like, no, we're showing that America's made mistakes and that we should be working to try and prevent them from happening again.
yeah,
Right? Like, you can't just say like everything's star spangled awesome 24/7. Like, we've screwed up. We've done a lot of bad stuff, but like moving forward, we should try and prevent doing more bad stuff. You know what I mean? And that's a very, 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 very simplified
yep,
thought process. But it's just, it is one of those things that like, and so like part of my impetus for making this is that for the student who's like, are we going to cover this? No, like I don't have time in class to cover the Tulsa race massacre. But if you want to take 30 to 45 minutes out of your night, and if it really means that much to you, like here it is. Yep. Here's a supplemental lesson, no assignment, no extra credit, but
it's just, but you take with it what you will.
I mean, we are not experts in African American studies or in Black history, but I guess we're trusted enough to educate children on the daily. So,
well, and I mean, I think though that I hope that like we have tens of followers and we always make that joke, but I know it's something that I talk about in my class when I come in from a day and kids ask me, now that they know that we have a podcast, they ask what we talked about, right? And I give a description, and they might go home and listen, they might not. But at the same time, what I also say is, and I think you do too, is that this is what I did. Someone brought this to me. I didn't know enough about it. I went and found it. I went and dug two perspectives. I went and dug out trying to figure out what happened here. And if that's the biggest life lesson, right? Like we have a lot of people in our day that take what is said right up front and that's face value and that's it, instead of doing their own research. And, as history teachers, we pride ourselves on being able to go and look up information and making sure that we have accurate. We don't just find one source and say, this is it. This is the one, right? We go back and we look. I mean, how many sources do you think you looked at for this one?
I actually was pretty mindful of that when I did this one because I thought there might be more scrutiny than on some of our other episodes. Mm-hmm. So I used an article from Ellen Nickmeyer of the Associated Press. There was an article on Investopedia. I also looked at sources from the Oklahoma Historical Society,
where I used
history.com, blackwallstreet.org, the Tulsa Historical Society,
that one,
as well as a number of different articles from NBC, CBS, CNN, New York Times. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, like, and again, like trying to sit there and figure out like where stuff comes from. I listened to congressional testimony that's on the internet.
Yep.
From like the subcommittee that I don't know what subcommittee it was, but I had something to do with like civil rights. Mm-hmm. And it was after, the Black Lives Matter movement where it's like, yeah, like there's been times so they officially in the time period say that like 36 people, I think, are killed. Mm-hmm. Historians postulated somewhere between the low estimate is 100, the high estimate is 300. They are still trying to conduct excavations in Tulsa to try and find evidence of the mass graves. It hasn't been going super great because at times, like, it gets started by one mayor, and then by the time that it moves forward, a new mayor comes into office, and that's not a campaign sticking point for them, so it falls to the wayside. But other people do have like primary sources, but they're like, people were just thrown in the river.
Yeah.
So it's like they weren't buried, they were just discarded. And again, that just shows the callousness that occurred based on like this perceived racial difference that, I don't know. I try and teach my students and my own daughters that people are people. It doesn't matter what color they are. Um, and
And
having taught in three very different places,
yeah,
the one thing I can say is kids are kids and parents are parents. And regardless of what country or what part of the state or what language they speak or what religion they are, they pretty much want the same thing for their kids. They want their kids to be more successful to them and grow up and get a good job and make good money and be successful. And a lot of them don't know how to do that.
yeah. But
You
they
know,
want it, and it's the biggest one. I don't want to get too far off the rails here for
uh-huh.
people listening and stuff like that. But yeah, we had the same conversation at a staff meeting, right? It's like it's one of those things where when a parent doesn't respond or the phone call home doesn't work or whatever as a teacher, right? It's not that their parents don't care. Like you said, every parent wants their kid to grow up to be more successful than they were and be happy. And sometimes they just don't know how. To help in those situations. Um, the biggest thing, like I said, I took from this is that there is hope for our future, right? There is hope. Bad things happen. There are extreme people with extreme viewpoints, and I hope that. And I like to think that we're at a point in our future or in the future in our point in our lives where it matters less and less what you look like, where you're from, and everything like that, and more valued about like who you are as a person. And kids, and Barker, you'll vouch for this too. Kids will give you hope, right? Like you talk about this stuff with kids, and their insights, right? They're always like, oh, social media, and the kids these days don't know. Blah, blah, blah. I'm 33 now, so I can get to talk like that. But it's one of those where I look at it and I just say, there's hope. Kids understand what's going on. Kids see things. They have life experiences. And if you ask them, if you legitimately ask a kid and explain a situation to them, they will make a comment that will probably surprise you. So I don't want to jump too far out off the rails here. But
no, and for me, like again, it's one of those ones where like there is no magic bullet.
nope,
Um,
never will be.
and if we had it, we'd be rich and we wouldn't be here. We'd be selling curriculum or something. Um, but yeah, it is one of those things that like I think the greatest thing to learn in life is a little bit of humility, and sometimes the greatest thing you can do in a conversation is listen.
Yes.
Um,
Second.
because even outside of race, but like everybody comes in with a different perspective and a different story. And if you're always talking, you can't hear other people's stories.
Yep.
And so like not knowing some of this stuff, and I mean like I had a situation where I put my foot in my mouth in a Chicano studies course at Wazoo. I was one of the only two like non-Chicano people in Chicano studies. Everybody else knew more coming in because that was their history. That was their like those were their people, and I was there for a diverse we'd take a diversity credit.
Yep.
And so I learned really quickly in that class that like I was going to learn a lot more by saying a lot less and just listening to other people because that was their experience. And so like just taking a back seat to let other people tell their story. Uh,
Sorry, I hope I'm not interrupting you.
no,
But building off of that, like, and this is where we're going. This is what gives me hope as a historian, right? And I like to think of myself as an amateur one, right? Where it's like, the 1980s, the 1990s are when we start looking at, and I want to word this better, minority. We start looking at minority history. We start looking at the people who lost wars, who lost in their uh like struggles in life or struggled through, and we start building that. And that's what like AP came out with their African American course, right? We're building back those things. Like women's history is a big thing. It's taking African American studies, taking Chicano studies. Like we're trying to bring that stuff back to the forefront. um
I would say just bring it to the forefront. I don't think it's ever been in the forefront. Like, so
yeah,
I
sorry, I didn't
think
say it
I
like that.
think the
You
better
are.
word, another way of saying that, and this could be more just educationalese, is non-dominant narratives.
Thank you. That's a way better way to say that.
Looking at the stories from the other side.
Mm-hmm.
Like in my master's program, and again, we're kind of rambling at this point. I apologize for that. I wrote a paper on the Alamo, and it was like modern sources, like modern historians were like, hey, we're just now like Mexico City starting to digitize their archives, so like we can read like what the Mexican generals said about this. And it's like, yeah, the people who didn't all die wrote stuff down, and maybe that would be some insight to what actually happened, instead of like kind of the historical mythos that we teach,
right,
or that we have. You know, we kind of act. I always teach my kids that history is a jigsaw puzzle, 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, and we have like 15 pieces, and we're trying to make the best picture we can.
Yep,
I think like you said, there is a movement in academia to try and find the people whose stories have not been pushed to the forefront, to be shared more.
Yep.
And to challenge students and hopefully people just in general to look at events from multiple perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like the kids like right now, like talking about the Chinese weather balloons and stuff, and kind of like making parallels to the Cold War. Like, are we rebuilding? Like, how tough? Like, is Russia really as incompetent as we say they are? Is China, you know, are we making China seem more competent than they are?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and somebody could come back and say, well, that's you with your American exceptionalism. And it's like, well, fair enough.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But like, it's just one of those things where like, I try and look at things from different perspectives and try and get kids to look at things from different perspectives and recognize that the history that we are given in our textbooks often the dominant narratives.
Right.
And it's, I guess, teachers across coursework often do really good work in trying to find those non-dominant stories that we can slide in there and supplement and say, like, here's the dominant narrative, here's, you know, a different look at it. And like, and again, go back and watch our, you know, Boston Massacre episode, where the image that we use, the dominant image that we use, we know is historically inaccurate, but it feeds the narrative that we tell as a nation. So
all right, we're gonna ramble too much if we keep going, because hopefully you enjoyed the first, I think it's like probably like the first 35 minutes were like on the Tulsa race massacre, and then the last 10 minutes have been about the history of education and teaching. So but again, that's why you listen, you tens of followers, you. So especially shots.
Most of you don't finish the videos.
Scott Ramsey's still watching, I know he is. So but I think that we're going to continue this theme. We're going to record again. I think we have we got about one more week of Black History Month, but we might add another one in there because I was thinking of a couple other things that we could talk about. So, but Bark, anything else for the good of the order?
Again, like, I think the beauty of this and where this really kind of started with was kids having questions, and we don't have time in class to give the answer we want to give.
Yep.
And so this is kind of our opportunity at times to give those answers, which is what tonight's episode was giving an opportunity to give an answer that I don't have time to give between the bells. And that if they really do care enough, they'll go listen. And then maybe it sparks them to read another book or go watch more sources and learn more. And maybe it encourages them that they're going to pursue a history degree or just be a more well-rounded person that knows more stuff.
Exactly.
So they can win at Jeopardy.
Try it out. We'll see. That'll be a whole episode if I get on, but we'll see. So, well, guys, I hope you appreciate it. We're pushing almost 50 minutes now. So until next time, I'm the Turn.
I'm the Bark.
Have a good night, everybody.
Be safe.
By golly, you just be well.